Welcome to Bread Theory. Tonight we are having another opportunity to sit in on a great class by Mike Hoag of Transformative Adventures Permaculture. Tonight the class topic is going to be about recognizing patterns and developing a pattern language to kind of read the landscape and make appropriate choices when you are setting up any sort of permaculture project. So sounds like it's about to start, so I'm gonna go ahead and switch over now, and that'll be the last I talk. But I'll always be in the chat too. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to put that up in the chat. I'll be able to relay that to Mike or answer it myself if I know the answer.
Are joining with the idea of watching the videos. I want to make sure too, I'm going to ask, everyone can find the videos. The first two videos are uploaded as well. So you should be able to watch those. Those will stay in the folders forever, so you always have them. So, all right. Well, I'm going to start the recording, and hopefully, like I said, some more of our students or fellow students will join us as we get going.
Recording in progress.
Hello. Oh. Hi, everyone. This is Mike. And yes, I will post a link to the videos for the classes, and I'll make sure you have the slideshow as well in a minute. So tonight is one of my favorite classes. We'll be talking, as you can see, about patterns. And what you're looking at right now are a set of shells, and I love to look at these nature patterns, these patterns found in nature. And one of the things that's really interesting about them is that nobody had to sit around in a design charrette to design these. Nobody needed any high-tech computer gadgets to design these slick flow forms. These forms, these beautiful patterns of these shells, evolved naturally from the pattern of the interaction of the mollusk and its environment. And the stages of growth and eating and everything of its life, the water pressure around it, all gave these shells their form. And in fact, we know that it's actually the period, the phases of eating and taking in energy, and then growth that give each compartment their shape. And the length of those times are dictated by a distant relationship with the moon. So that even these life forms, even the ones that are found at the bottom of the sea, where there's not even a visual sign of the moon that they can detect, still get the shape of their shells from an interaction, from a connection with something as distant as the moon. And it's that interconnection and that pattern of growth and connection with the environment that gives them their form. A lot of patterns around us in nature work in the similar sort of way. They're not designed by expert designers. They're grown naturally by organisms interacting with their ecosystems and their environments. So today we're going to be talking all about patterns, one of the big topics of permaculture. But first, I'd like to go back to our last Monday class, our first Permaculture Design Certificate course class, and talk about some of the topics from that day, while we take a few seconds to check in here. Let's see if I can find it. Okay. So in our last class, we took a look at this as a sort of game, a potential exercise for looking at the permaculture principles, the two sets of permaculture principles, the Holmgren principles and the Mollison principles. Of course, there are many other sets of principles now, but these are the two main ones that a lot of permaculturists use. And our principle of transformative action, which is to grow connections to nature and community. And I challenge you to perhaps think about how a lot of these can kind of reduce or have a relationship to the idea of growing connections in communities. So I'd like to say hello to you all and give us a chance to kind of check in really quick. And to do that, I'd like to take a look at these Holmgren principles, and perhaps it'd be good if you would pick one of these, if you can see them, and pick one of them, and perhaps say, give us an idea of how this relates to this idea of rebuilding connections and building connections. And if anyone would like to go first, I could go first, except I'd choose the easiest one. And if anyone feels like chiming in, you can just go ahead and chime in. Oh, sure, I can restate my my request. It's a good thing to do to help process some of these principles, to see if we can process them in some different ways. And what I'm asking is, how can some of these Holmgren principles be related to the idea of building connection to nature and community, or building connections? So to give an example myself, we could look at, oh, I see Noah's raising his hand. Noah, please go ahead. Give it a shot, then I'll go.
The principle of producing no waste can produce a lot of connections. You can put a sign in front of your yard saying, please donate your leaves, or there are apps for collecting food scraps from the neighborhood. It's very easy to make connections with nature and your community with producing no waste. You can go dumpster diving, like somebody in our group does, who will remain nameless.
I think we have quite a few dumpster divers in our ongoing PDC. Yeah, that was a great example. In fact, I'd take it even a step further, Noah, and say that all waste is simply energy or resources that has not found a connection yet. There is no such thing as waste, right? All waste, all pollution is simply a resource that hasn't been properly connected to yet. So if we're talking about dumpster diving, you have dumpsters filled with what we call waste, and really they're resources just looking for connection. So that was a great example to start with. I see Zach in the comments, using the edges and valuing the marginal can mean trying to make connections with people who our current system marginalizes. Yes, intersectionality, absolutely. And in fact, you could say again that this whole idea of a margin is the edge between two things, right? So when we talk about margins, what we're really talking about is connections. And absolutely, people who are marginalized by society, people pushed to the edges of society, what we really need to do is be building connections to those people and helping those people build connections to the resources they need. So absolutely, that's another great example. Anyone else have one? I saw Noah was raising his hand again, but I see Melanie now too.
Yeah, I'll give it a try. In my PDC, it was heavily focused on Mollison. So this is great because I'm not really fluent in Holmgren's principles. So I was thinking about how obtaining a yield, has resulted in us being able to, for example, we had just too many tomatoes to eat. So we put out a table in our front yard with tomatoes for any walker-bys, and how that invited conversation and curiosity about what we were doing, and how if you have an even larger yield, you can, be at your farmer's market, and that's another community space. Another thing I was thinking about the yield is that having a yield for a lot of people, equates some kind of success in when you're growing food, right? Having a yield, and so being able to use whatever the yield is, or whatever you have at a given time, to build bridges to individuals, to community through whatever you're writing about or talking about, like on social media, or even on an Instagram feed. I know I've gotten lots and lots of feedback by having pictures of this is what's happening in the garden, and how that invites conversation. So those are just a few ideas about how that might be connected.
Oh, absolutely. If you want to build a lot of connections with people, then you want to share your yield, you want to obtain a yield, and show people that we humans connect over things like food and culture and meals, and it's absolutely a great thing to share with people. And again, really obtain a yield is talking about connection. It's talking about our energy connection with plants and with the ecosystem and with the soil. And that connection is our food. That connection is what nourishes us. And hopefully we give back to it as well. So again, I could say that obtain a yield is simply a way of saying, make connections again. It's almost another paraphrase.
And it's true that when we have a yield, I've just mentioned things that are kind of human-centric, but it's also true that when we have a yield, our worms benefit because we do vermiculture, so they get the scraps, and our birds benefit because we put stuff out in the yard for them, and then the soil as well when we're composting from said yields. So
yeah, absolutely. And Christina, I saw you did one of these too.
Yeah, I wanted to continue on Zach's idea. For me, these principles like use the edges and value the marginal is very connected to this use and value diversity, and also integrate rather than segregate. So since I'm in a context where we're talking about social issues, we have been reminded that each and every one of us with its personality, has its own spice. In a way, it has its own background and, perhaps point of view. And we were given quite a few examples when one person had the courage to stand in a group while taking a decision. Okay. And how important that was for the whole group, because no one would have realized that important thing. And in terms of like in the garden, all these things kind of like boil down for me in the importance we give to growing unusual vegetables or things that otherwise would be foraged from a garden. So all these things can save us actually a lot of energy and labor in general, and do good for the earth too. So lots of benefits from, integrating and using diversity and using the marginal.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are great examples too. Just scrolling through here, I see a few other people on. If anyone else wants to do one, please feel free to. Otherwise, I am going to if someone wants to do another one, you can as well. I'm going to go and take a look one more time at Facebook while you do that. I'm going to disappear for a second. I'll still be able to hear you. And just make sure that some more of our students who are signed up aren't looking for the class and aren't missing us. All right, I'll be right back. I did see Noah raised his hand a second time, so if you wanted to do another one, you'd be welcome to.
I'll pass, Mike. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I did get one note from someone who isn't feeling well. We're just going to continue on and see if other people show up. And if not, it's a good time to give a reminder that all the classes are recorded. And so you can always check in and listen to these presentations and do the assignments. And if you ever have questions, you can send me the questions or put them up in the Facebook group and get feedback from people there. I love the idea of using that feedback or that Facebook group to catch and store the energy and build connections within that group from this class, right? We're taking information and discussion and ideas and inspiration from this class and using it, catching it and storing it in that Facebook group to build connections as well. So yeah, and before we go today, I will share those folders again to just make sure that you all know where to look to find all the videos and the information. And we're going to continue on. Okay, so this brings us back. As I scroll through here, I am going to just point out a couple of things. What we're not talking about today are some of these topics like observational info and what I have on here, permaculture's most powerful tools, because we have now pulled these out and placed them in a separate class, which we're going to do on Wednesday, which is our second workshop in our landscape transformation program. I left them in this slideshow because they're part of the traditional permaculture design certificate course curriculum for this class. So we've slightly reorganized things, but I left them in here just for people who might want to see them in the context of the whole PDC, or maybe you'll want to do a PDC and take and adapt my materials and you'll want to keep them here. So I kept everything in here. We're going to get to this content on things like zone and sector analysis and relative location on Wednesday. Today, we're going to go into patterns more. And by the way, why are we talking about patterns? Why is this topic of patterns important for us to discuss? Does anyone have thoughts about that? Yeah, Christina?
It is because nature works in patterns. So if you want to work with nature, better understand how nature works. And they might not be really necessarily patterns in terms of form, like patterns are also the seasons and, you know, wind patterns and so on.
Yes. Yeah, good point. All right. Excuse me. So Bill Molson gave 3 reasons why he wanted to include patterns. And one is what Christina just said, that it's kind of necessary if you're going to be working with nature to understand some about nature patterns and start to think about that in a way. A second thing is based on the idea of the pattern language concept we'll talk about in a second. And that's that patterns allow us to share information across disciplines and with other people really easily. And then a third reason he gave was kind of related to the first 2, which is to be able to talk about the pattern, about applied patterns. So those were the 3 reasons he gave. I kind of slightly blew these up a little bit more, and to just include this idea of patterns. I like to call it pattern play. Part of what we do in a creative endeavor is simply play around with patterns to try to create new things. Then another one that I have in here is patterns give some forms of accountability. And the main reason why I include this is that a lot of us who will be working as designers and doing work for other people, being able to say, this pattern has this research to it, we know that it works, gives us a form of accountability and allows us to present and do work that hopefully will work. So using patterns that are proven can give us a form of accountability. So those are 5 reasons or 5 kind of goals for tonight that we're going to kind of go through. But the first is just to give a definition of patterns. Or as far as we're concerned in a permaculture context, patterns are ideas in a form that can be easily shared and replicated. So when we're talking about patterns, we might talk about nature patterns, but really the nature, the phenomenon, the thing that's happening in nature might be a wave or it might be tessellation. But it's really the pattern part is what's happening up in here. Our brains are amazing pattern computers, and our brains look for patterns in nature. So when we're talking about patterns, we're talking about, in a sense, the human part of it, how we perceive nature and how we can share that. So in a way, patterns are a form of human communication when we're talking about patterns. By the way, this pattern, what are some things, does this pattern that we're looking at mean anything to you? What does it look like? Of course, it probably looks a lot like, well, for one thing, it's right there in a form. I use them a lot. But what does this imply anything to you? It's an interesting exercise. I'll tell you what it is. It's the ancient alchemical glyph for journey or adventure. And I think that's really interesting because what I see when I look at it are that it implies perhaps a set of mountains and a road going through the mountain pass. And it's interesting, the lot of the alchemical glyphs that we use in transformative adventures for transformation, for transcendence, for adventure, all involve mountains. A symbol of a barrier to overcome, a symbol of, oh yes, tents and teepees as well, a symbol of a struggle that we have to go through, from which we learned, and then we come through the other side. So something as simple as one squiggly line can encode a lot of different ideas and concepts and help us communicate them. So one of the reasons why we're talking about patterns is because of this book. Are people familiar? I know some of you are familiar with this great book called A Pattern Language. Christopher Alexander is usually listed as the lead author, but of course, a lot of people contributed to this work, A Pattern Language. And A Pattern Language is an interesting book and an interesting concept because Christopher Alexander was tasked with the idea of helping DIY, do it yourself, and do it ourselves, do it ourself communities, make better architecture and do better building. And be able to share ideas about building across disciplines. Because as it is, you have to spend 10 years to become an architect. But maybe you don't need a degree in architecture to build a tool shed. So how do we communicate good best practices for architecture to someone who simply wants to build a tool shed or perhaps build their own house? The idea that he came up with came from computer science today and how computer apps are shared. Because today, if you want to build an app, you can go and you can find open source information and find little pieces of apps. If you want to make a permaculture app, you might take a banking app for the money part of it. You could take map apps to do mapping parts, and you put them all together and you can create a permaculture app for an iPhone, right? And so this idea of a pattern language was that we could communicate in patterns, and people can then take patterns and put them together and play with them and create something better. As it turns out, this is now a research-based and proven approach to improving design. And it has been tested in different fields where creating a pattern language for something and then exposing people to the pattern language, even for a brief time, improves the designs as graded by experts in the field. So this concept actually works. And one of the ways we could view permaculture is as a pattern language for building sustainable human settlements, maybe even a sustainable society. So it's really quite a cool idea, and we're going to play around with it some more today. So with this idea of sharing patterns is an important, kind of part of what patterns are. Like this thing. This is just, looks like a sliver of light appearing on a spiral on a cave wall. But this is the Anasazi sun dagger. And it encodes a lot of information into just one little glyph on a cave wall. Depending on where the sun is, the dagger moves across the spiral so that it can actually show when the spring equinox is, when the summer solstice is, when the fall equinox is. And others have looked at it and even found there might be distinct markings on the dial for different planting times for different crops. So a lot of information can be encoded into just this one little thing that it would take quite a sophisticated iPhone app to be able to communicate everything that this one little spiral on a cave wall communicates. So the point of patterns is that patterns encode and organize large amounts of information for us and allow us to share them and think about them. In other words, patterns make easy because they communicate so much information in a short amount of time. Think about these things. This is how our brains function, right? Think about how much useless information we know about all of these patterns. And the patterns aren't just one-dimensional. They're very deep, right? They communicate a lot of information. For example, if I had a friend who wanted me to cater their wedding or an event, a permaculture event, something like that. And they were in a real hurry. And I asked, what do you want? What kind of food do you want for the wedding? And they sent me a Starbucks logo. Well, that would communicate a whole lot of ideas for me about what to make for the wedding. Or if they sent me the KFC logo or the Burger King logo, for one, I might think these people need to develop some better taste in food, but not to be too judgmental. It would still communicate a lot of information because we wrap patterns together and encode them and make deeply layered meanings out of these sorts of patterns. So hopefully, in something like a permaculture setting, we'll replace these sorts of patterns with more meaningful and healthful patterns. Now, this is one of the reasons why permaculturists tend to love the classic herb spiral. It's not because it's the most useful and best garden design ever. They are pretty handy for a lot of people, especially if you're a new gardener. But what they really do is this one simple pattern encodes a lot of information about how to have a good garden. And for those who don't know it, an herb spiral is a simple spiral filled with soil or planting medium. It's ideal if it's made out of urbanite or recycled concrete. So it's really nice to make these out of recycled concrete blocks. I personally don't recommend using or buying materials for them. They're really best when they're using recycled materials to build herb spirals. But then we build this and we have a multi-layered garden in the form of a spiral. And it's a great little garden for planting herbs. I would like to talk about some of the ideas about gardening that are encoded into this herb spiral. Does anyone have one idea that comes packaged in with this herb spiral pattern for how to have a good garden and a better garden? Or feel free to throw some in the chat if you want. I was just giving a little bit of space in case someone wanted to jump in. One idea of it is microclimates. The classic herb spiral has different layers, which means it has a sunny side, it has a darker side, it has dry soil on the top, and it has wetter soil at the bottom with the moisture. Because there's a big pile of soil, the bottom of it really holds moisture very well. So we have a nice, rich, moist soil layer at the bottom, which means we can put herbs that are like aromatic herbs that actually have the most flavor when they're in dry soil, and they're healthier in dry soil, up at the top layers. Things like lavender and mastic thyme. In the middle, we might have other thymes that we could plant in there. They tend to like drier soil. And at the bottom, in the richer, wetter soil, we can plant basils and mints, lemon balm. So we have all of these different spaces, microclimates, and it teaches us to put the right plant in the right place and to pay attention to these microclimates. That's just one idea that the classic herb spiral encodes. A second is that the herb spiral shows us this transformative process that we can invest our energy into one permanent garden setup that will last many years and be useful over a long time. So it catches and stores our energy into a permanent garden structure instead of having an annual garden for the herbs. A third thing is that it's very energy efficient. If we put the herb spiral right by the kitchen door, then we always have a place to run out to grab these things that we use at almost every meal, instead of having to run out to a vegetable garden to gather them. Yet another thing that it encodes is to prioritize things that have the biggest health impact. Herbs like this are very nutrient rich. So having a dedicated space to them where you have regular access to them means that we can use these plants the most every day in our meals, and it has a big health impact. So it's one small garden with an outsized impact on our health as well. So and of course, it includes a pattern of biophilia, of loving and appreciating nature patterns like the spiral. And of course, the meta thing here, it's a great teaching tool because it shows how one pattern can encode a lot of different ideas to it. And now we can take it and play with it, because maybe we're thinking, I love herbs. This is too small for me to have an herb garden. we can still use the ideas of microclimates and relative location and all this and just blow it up and make a bigger herb spiral. Or maybe you have other issues with the herb spiral design. It means we can play with it and adapt it, think about it creatively, and come up with something better from this pattern. So this shows how a pattern like herb spiral can communicate a wealth of information and options and be a really great creative design tool. Anyone else have thoughts or comments or additions to things encoded in the herb spiral?
You kind of mentioned it with like proximity to the house, that it's easy to get to. I was thinking also that just the size of an herb spiral, like friendly to reach into and, you know, cut off leaves because of the height differences. And it's just like super easy accessibility from each side.
Absolutely. That's another great bit of information encoded in it. And
sorry, also you could, the ability of certain herbs to prevent certain pests, right? Make it also like a great place to do some complementary plantings, like of salad greens or other things that, you know, grow well along with herbs. And then the herbs provide the benefit of preventing bugs from eating them.
Absolutely. In fact, to me, one of the very first, if I'm talking to someone who's a brand new gardener, to me, not to be super critical or anything, the way I was taught gardening was kind of to learn annual gardening. And then I took like master gardener programs when I became an adult, and they focused on the same things. Grow what you like. If you like tomatoes, grow tomatoes and start with those. And people always start with annual gardens that are a ton of hard work, and you have to redo them every year. When you start with an herb spiral, you're producing something that's going to have a long-lasting effect, and they're easier plants, so you're going to be successful. So to me, one of the very first things that I try to get people to do is herb spiral, and then build onto that herb spiral one little bed for like greens and some extra veggies, and the herb spiral is built in pest and disease control for the other garden, just like you were saying. So that's a brilliant thing encoded in it too. Yeah, in fact, I think we had some examples. I think Valida had a great herb spiral, Hugel spiral. So that's another thing. We can take these patterns and we can mix and match and combine them and play with them. You know, there's no reason why the herb spiral has to be the classic herb spiral. The point of it is that it is a pattern we can take and play with. Just like if I were building a computer app and I want to make a permaculture app and I started with some tools from banking, it doesn't mean I have to build a banking app. I just take the parts that I need to build my permaculture app. So this kind of pattern design concept and pattern language concept can be really powerful as a design and creativity tool. Okay. What's this? Oh yeah, exactly. In fact, at Lily House, I liked my herb spiral that I had in the few years in my project before Lily House. I liked it so much, but the biggest problem I had with the herb spiral was it transformed my cooking. I was at the herb spiral every day and I always wanted more herbs. So when we did Lily House, I wanted a much bigger herb spiral. So the first big garden at Lily House is 2 unwound giant herb spirals that are walk-on, but they have the same exact form and function of having good drainage, of having a pond built into them, of having shady areas and dry areas, only they were giant. So we can take this idea of something like the herb spiral and blow it up. This is something to always keep in mind. The herb spiral is like a Rorschach test for people and how creative we can be. Some people will see it and say, oh, it's just a little herb garden, I'm not going to waste my time with it. Other people can see it and say, I could do some really cool things with that. Maybe I don't want an herb spiral, but I can take that idea and make really cool things out of that pattern. And yes, absolutely, this is a Jackson Pollock painting. And these are really interesting because this is one of his paintings that uses a nature pattern. When he did these, he used a pendulum in order to create patterns of paint on a fractal pattern. And it turns out that the fractal patterns that he created in these paintings can be measured. And this is the part that's really mind-blowing. We've now looked at the Jackson Pollock paintings that he created using these fractal patterns and the ones that he didn't. And there's been an analysis of them. And the ones that are based on nature patterns, on fractals, sell for a lot more money than the ones that don't, because they're more attractive to people. And humans can see them. And a lot that we've done tests where we've had people guess which ones were which and rank them. And people aren't right all the time, but way better than chance. People can guess which Pollocks are based on the fractal patterns. So that kind of brings us to this. This is, let's see how we can do. Oh, this is not 6 Jackson Pollock paintings. This is 2 Jackson Pollock paintings and 4 actual nature fractal patterns. So the top one is a set of, so I used to do this as a trick question, and it was mean teacher thing. No, the top one is a set of root patterns from woody perennial planting. The top right is mycelia and a pattern of mycelia. The bottom 2 left are a Jackson Pollock and that was fractal, and a Jackson Pollock that is not fractal. Maybe you can guess which one is which one you think is fractal and which one isn't. And then the middle right is a seagrass pattern, and the bottom right is tree branches in winter against the sky. So, and but they all kind of do have a certain feel to them. And the bottom left one is actually the fractal Jackson Pollock, I believe. So, but we'll talk about those patterns in a second. But it's just interesting to know that humans actually, we do have built-in pattern recognition software, and we can tell which ones are fractals and which ones aren't. Tessellations are another very interesting pattern from nature. And these, again, like the shells, grow naturally from the interactions of our growth, our patterns of storing energy and building, and our interactions with our environment. And tessellations are interacting or interlocking patterns of cells. So we could say these are man-made tessellations, and they're very useful. And in our last class, our first landscape transformation program class, we talked about this pattern, the structure of home gardens as a form of sort of cellular tessellating pattern found in human environments. And we find similar patterns around the world wherever humans have gone, of little home garden structures, often surrounded by cellular walls of hedgerows, That one's in Japan. These are, of course, Russian dacha gardens. We'll talk about some of these patterns when we talk in a future class about home garden patterns. But it's just very interesting to think that our human societies, when they're healthy and vibrant, grow in very much the same sort of way as a snail or a tortoise may grow their shells. And we can, of course, talk about the famous Fibonacci sequence that you find in broccoli that comes from a simple spiral pattern. And again, these patterns are predicted very easily from phases of growth and of an organism. So they're almost universal in nature and in natural systems because of this pattern of storing up energy and phases of growth that we go through. And so this leads us, of course, Romanesco is a beautiful broccoli that is filled with little Fibonacci spirals and fractals, and it's wonderful. So it's just kind of fun to take a look at these, but it really leads us to one of our big topics of the night, which is this idea that nature doesn't design things. Nature evolves. It grows and transforms from where it is and its environment. And the scientific term of this study of growth is, of course, morphogenesis. So this brings us back to this idea. We have two main modes of creation that we can think about whenever we're going to any kind of creative act. One is design. And when we're talking about design, pattern languages and patterns become very important. The other is transformation, which is kind of growing something new. My opinion is we should always be thinking of working with these together and finding a balance between them that suits the project and suits the individuals involved. And we'll talk a bit about what makes them more appropriate for different circumstances. I'd like to point out these are some graphs from the Making Permaculture Stronger project by Dan Palmer. And Dan Palmer's been working with David Holmgren on these. And so this is kind of some cutting edge ideas from the world of permaculture design. And this comes from Christopher Alexander. Christopher Alexander invented this great pattern language concept, and it's now been found in a lot of research to be a research-based way to improve designs. It was successful. It works, but it doesn't work as well as Christopher Alexander wanted it to. Christopher Alexander was looking at the designs that people were making with his pattern language, and he was still kind of disappointed in them. Maybe subjectively or objectively they were better, but they still were kind of disappointing to him, and they were not. And as a process, it didn't. It had some fallbacks. So he began looking at this idea of how nature transforms, of natural morphogenesis, and he became very interested in the idea that the most beautiful, vibrant architecture and communities in the world were not designed. Nobody sat down in a design charrette to create them. They grew and they evolved naturally, much in the same way that snail shells do. So he became very interested in how we can use that. So that's, of course, the basis for the idea of transformative process and transformative adventures, and helping people with this process of transformation informed by design. And Dan Palmer was taking these same ideas and came up with his own set of ideas around it. And we're not going to go in depth onto this. I'm just going to skip to this idea. And to Dan, we have two major modes of creation. We have one that's about design, assembling and fabricating is what he calls it. He puts permaculture on the bottom left here. And
Thank
in
you,
this,
Dan
it's a
Simpson,
very
for the raid.
intellectual thing, right? We come up with a design
I see
in advance.
it's
we write it down on paper.
automated
the
part of your name.
details.
I apologize for
Then
that.
we try
Thank you very
to
much for the
create
raid. We're
that
in the
thing
middle of
real
watching
world.
a class about permaculture right now.
Of course, anyone who's
from
done that has probably found things don't always
transformative
go to
adventure
plan,
permaculture.
Right?
And
so then you have to be
yeah,
careful
this
about how you
is
change things.
Mike Hoag,
Dan has
been on
really
the show
come to
before, and he's
the
talking about
conclusion that,
patterns
that
and
permaculture
recognizing them
needs
in
to
nature
move to
and
this
helping them,
idea
or using those
of,
patterns to help your
of what he
designs.
calls
So,
generative
thank you very much.
transformation, of really starting more with this idea of understanding where you're at now and growing to where you want to be in the future. Think about it this way. I'm going to try to make this whole concept as simple as I can and say the biggest drawback that I see with design is that people make a design and it looks amazing on paper, but they never actually get it done. It might have, like, you know, a permaculture farm that has integrated pony rides and a sun-powered windmill that's also a Ferris wheel that kids can ride, and, like, you know, it has a water pad that irrigates rice paddies, and it's all built in and super, but it's so complex and it's impossible to get to from where we're at now, so it never actually happens. The best designs are the ones that actually make it into the real world, right? Not the ones that look amazing on paper but can't actually get into the real world. So the problem with design is the idea of not understanding a process for how to get there from where we're at now. The idea of generative transformation starts with where we're at now and looks at how we can evolve towards something better and where we want to be. So Dan has really turned to this idea that this is what we need to do. I will share his perspective with you, but I somewhat disagree. To me, design, I like both. So if you look at my book or this class, I always recommend that we do phases of both, that we do design and have a design, but that we also take an attitude of transforming things through these transformative adventures kinds of processes. The benefits of design are that, for one, if you are designing with other people and you're doing a project with people, having design like patterns gives us better accountability because and this is a big thing to me, because a lot of people will kind of promote themselves as permaculture designers and they don't ever actually, like, do a design, and it almost becomes like what they're selling is magic they've learned. Like, hire me, I'll do magic. And there's no accountability to that. There's no outcomes, there's no plan. And so that tends to make unhappy relationships. When we have design, then a designer sits down with people, you do a charrette, you communicate together, you make a plan on paper, and that provides something of accountability, right? There's actually a thing on paper. And whether or not you've done something, you've made something, for one, and people can follow that and get it done. And if it doesn't work, then we can go back and fix it. But at least there's some form of accountability to it. And if you're doing group work, and remember, every garden is always a group project, right? Every garden is always a group project. If you're doing a group project, having some amount of design allows us to communicate, well, this is my plan, this is my vision. I want to have an herb spiral here, I want to have a vegetable garden here, I want to have a pond here. What do you all think about this? So having a design allows for better accountability in professional context, more collaboration, You could have a more creative design process. There are the drawbacks we talked about. It can be very hierarchical. It can be a thing where someone is like, I'm the designer, this is my plan. So there are pros and cons of both approaches. To me, the key is to know which to use which and when. So just bringing this back again to this idea, we have two major modes of design or of creation: designing something in advance and then creating it, and a transformative process where we kind of play and things happen over time and hopefully evolve in a positive direction. In my opinion, every project should be a mix of these two, and it's always going to depend on the people involved and what the goals of the project are. Some people are natural design geeks. They want to have that plan. Other people aren't design thinkers. They want to play in the garden and get stuff done. So just knowing and being able to think about these two things and choose them intentionally can be powerful. And just knowing that we always should have a bit of both in the mix, in my opinion. With that, it's about time for us to take a break. So I want to open up and see if there are any thoughts and questions on this idea of these two modes of creation: design, which is always really pattern design, and transformation. Maybe you want to share which approach has been better for you. Are you the kind of person who wants to always have a paper design and plan, or you just kind of play in the garden and get stuff done?
I definitely see it as not linear at all. And sometimes there's a design and then an execution, and a lot of times there's a wandering around and there's an idea on a particular day, and there's some energy to just like, what if we put this here, or we did this, or we moved that then might later get codified onto the plan after it's already kind of happened. And so I appreciate you naming those two modes, because we tend to think very linear, that we gotta, plan it out on paper first and then do it. And it's not actually how it happens in real time, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing, so when I do the landscape transformation program, and Cassie, I see you mentioned this too, I'm finding it to be a more satisfying process to lead people in a process of transformation for themselves than to work as a designer for someone. So I'm finding like this Transformative Adventures program is probably the way I'm going to continue to, most of my work is probably going to continue to gravitate towards that as a program, as opposed to becoming like Mike Hoag, famous designer. And it's not that there's a problem with design either. If that's your goal, then that's awesome. I find that, but if you do want to do that, I would say maybe also you want to have some mechanism in your work for how to integrate transformation and leading your clients through a transformation process of their own as well. So it can be a hybrid of both. We can always think of these two things. Having a design, having a plan can be very freeing too. Something that I find people get stuck on all the time is they'll want to transform their landscape. They have their permaculture vision, it's very hazy, but then they don't start because they're like, well, I can't build a garden bed there or plant an apple tree there, because what if I want to put the trampoline there? Or what if that's going to be the pond? So, or maybe I want to build a pond over here, but what if that's going to be the apple trees? And so people get deadlocked into uncertainty, not having a plan. Doing some kind of plan, some kind of design, frees people up to start the transformation process. Right, analysis paralysis is real. And one way to overcome it is just having enough design. In our next class, we'll talk about the design acronym. I use plenty. which just means we just need to do plenty enough design, just like if we do this much design, so we know where things are at, it's enough to guide our overall vision and free us up to start playing around and getting stuff done, because we've thought about it, and we know that we at least have a few options for where the trampoline and the pool and the apple trees can go, right? So then we can play around with those things and start getting stuff done. And we know not to play around in the places where we're probably going to put the apple tree. So the combination, absolutely, the combination of these two things together and being able to think about them in a deliberate and intentional way can be very powerful. All right, with that said, it's 7:02. Why don't we come back at 7:10, and we're going to continue playing around and exploring patterns a little bit more. All right, be back in a few. Feel free to chat while I'm off grabbing a little more water.
All right, let me just get back into the normal mode. I'm going to turn that off for just a second. Welcome in, Raiders. Sorry I couldn't give you more of a proper welcome, but we're in the middle of watching a live Zoom meeting of a permaculture design class taught by Mike Hoag of Transformative Adventures Permaculture. He's been nice enough to open up the class and allow me to broadcast it on my various platforms. I do the channel Bread Theory. My name is Zach. Most of what I do is go through theory audiobooks chapter by chapter. We usually take about a chapter or two a week. Lately, we've been doing Alexander Berkman's The ABC of Anarchism, which is also known as What is Anarcho-Communism. Put that on hiatus a little bit because we had this wonderful opportunity to look at this permaculture course and get like a front row seat to it. But that's usually what I do, is I just take a theory book. I try to alternate back and forth between like communism, anarchism, sometimes socialism as well, or more broadly leftist topics. And yeah, that's my goal, is to help get people through theory, because so much of it is quite dense and old and perhaps hard to relate to the modern era. So Timmer's Crutch says it's so cool, the theory of it, like bonsai. If you have to let them kind of do what they do and nurture with subtle nudges. Yeah, that can definitely be a way to do things. And the entire goal of permaculture is to look at ourselves more as not just creating a living factory where we have an input and then we take out produce or animal products as the output. It's to be more of an active participant in our ecosystems, to be a hand in shaping that ecosystem, kind of the way that beavers, when a beaver makes a dam, yes, it causes flooding, but that flooding creates so many new microclimates that it supports much more life than was there beforehand. In fact, there's tons of wildlife that depends on beavers and their dams to have their own healthy and productive habitat. So permaculture seeks to kind of put humans in that same place as a beaver, where we're not just coming in and imposing our will and, I don't care if tomatoes don't grow in this climate, I'm going to irrigate the hell out of it. It's more like working with nature instead of against it, as a co-participant in it. And the end result, ideally, is kind of creating an ecosystem together with these natural actors, where you do a lot of work up ahead at the beginning of things, and then gradually over time, as say different predator insects come in and take over the responsibility of keeping pests in check, or as birds come in and provide you fertilizer for free as they deposit their poop as they go about their business. As all these natural systems start up and interact with one another, the goal is over time to do less and less work, and to spend more and more time just kind of like you were saying, Timmer's Crutch, nudging here and there, but not making as big of an impact. and then just enjoying the bounty that is produced. So there's a number of reasons that permaculture has not been more widely accepted, and the main one being that it takes a lot more. It takes a lot more knowledge and planning and ideas to kind of get it off the ground. It's not just, well, what are you going to plant? Well, soy this year? Okay, let's do everything in soy, and next year's corn. You know, you have to plan a whole bunch of different stuff. You have to think many generations into the future. What is the landscape going to look like? Climate change plays a big impact on that. How are things going to change? What stuff can we plant now that's going to be well adapted to conditions in the future? So it takes a lot more planning. So that's one thing. For another thing, because we're doing a whole lot of little things rather than a lot of one or two things, so instead of just having a cornfield, just having a soy field, we have, our little grove of almonds over here. And we may have, some annual vegetables like your typical peas, carrots, tomatoes, stuff like that. But there's little patches of them here and there. It's not, as far as the eye can see. We're doing a lot of little things, which is good because it builds resilience for one thing. So if you have a really bad year for carrots, it's not as though you lose your entire crop, for example. Also, it helps build resilience against pests because instead of if you plant an entire field of corn, all it takes is one pest that really likes corn and it could wipe you out. This way, if you have just a little stand of corn, it's not a big deal if a pest overtakes it one year because you have a bunch of other stuff to fall back on. It's like having a bunch of backup plans. But because of all of those little bits of things that we're doing here and there and all over the place, it makes it really hard to mechanize. So it's hard to do it on a very large scale. It takes a lot more human labor because, you can't just rent a combine and harvest everything. You can't, or harvester, I should say. You can't just rent a seed sower and sow everything. That's a lot of stuff by hand. It's one reason that permaculture tends to rely more on perennial plants. Those are plants that they don't die every year. Most of the vegetables and fruits you see in the grocery store, well, not as much the fruits, but mostly the vegetables, those are from plants that die every year. They put out a bunch of seed, like a tomato, or peas or beans or things like that. They put out a bunch of seed and then the plant dies and you have to replant it the next year. A perennial, by contrast, you plant it once and it produces stuff year after year, just like an apple tree. That's a great example of a perennial. So it comes back year after year. You don't have to plant an apple tree every single year. So that is one way that permaculturists tend to save labor. And then also, by having a little bit of things here and there and all over the place, you have different seasons that are coming, different plants are coming into their season. So one week, the carrots are really good to harvest. The next week, it might be the walnuts, and you get a walnut harvest. You're never overwhelmed because you never have such a huge harvest the way you do with like corn. Corn has one season. You harvest the corn at that time, and then looks like we're starting the class again. So I'll pause my thought right there. But if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. I can always relay it to Mike. This is a live class that you are watching. So I'm not going to be speaking much myself, but I'll still be in the chat and you can still interact with me that way. And I can interact with Mike by extension. So if you have any questions, please ask. I love talking about permaculture and so does Mike. So we'll get back to it.
I want to chop back on a little early because there was a really interesting point about the difference between theory and praxis. We could, and the difference between, and how that relates to design and transformation. And it's a really interesting point to get into because yeah, and it just all the same factors we were talking about. If we're talking about designing a better world to live in, a better society, it means we do have to have we do have to have theory. We have to have the design component of it. What does that provide? The same thing that it does with the design plan. It provides us one with accountability. and with collaboration. When we do theory for a better society and talk about theory for a better society, we're talking about, it provides that accountability. We're saying, this is the kind of world we want to create. Are you guys cool with that? It provides some accountability there too. Will that actually work? We can discuss those things. And it frees us up to actually take action towards making a better world and do that work, because we know which direction we're going in. And then, of course, we also need the transformation part of it. We're never going to get to a better world if we don't get involved in a transformative process for building a better world. And the fault of design can be the same fault in theory. We could have a great theory for what kind of world we want to build, but maybe we're never actually going to be able to get there from where we're at. So we need to have a transformative process. What are the things that we do to grow a better world together in the same way that the snail grows its shell? You know, what is it that we do together that brings that new, better world into being? So we need both. We need to have, you know, two sides of the same coin, but it's also good to think about both intentionally. So I'm happy that question came up. All right. Anyone else have anything they want to add or throw into this discussion before we return and get back to some talking about nature patterns? Yeah, Noah.
You talk about in your book about using systems for soil building, systems for weed control, systems for water harvesting, systems for avoiding pests. How would you apply systems to integrate all of that into an herb spiral?
Yeah. So again, he's talking about some of our transformative adventures stuff is about what does a transformative process look like? And you know, what are those things? How can we go about things in this sort of way that creates better systems? And the basic idea of how natural things transform is within, you know, it's always whole at every point. You know, everything is always interconnected and whole. You know, there's never any point where a snail needs to have buy something from ExxonMobil, get some gasoline in order to complete its shell, right? It's always whole. And so as we grow our yards, as we grow our environments, as we transform our landscapes, we have to make sure that everything that we create is whole. Otherwise, we're going to create something that's disjunct. So what I will be teaching in these Wednesday classes on landscape transformation is this process where we think about if we're going to build a new garden, like an herb spiral, we think in advance about all of the needs of the herb spiral as we create the herb spiral. So what are the things that an herb spiral needs? It needs water. So, for example, I might build the herb spiral partly over a basin here. We're going to draw it. We're going to actually kind of do a little bit of design here about this. So I'll start with blue. Here's the downspout from the house, and this plumbs again. And I'm going to build an underground water basin here and line it again, like I said last time, with maybe a layer of sodium bentonite clay under here. So there's going to be a bit of an underlying pond there. Then when I build the herb spiral, I'll kind of offset it here so that it's not all over this. And the herb spiral, you know, will be like this. so that there's always access to the water that roots can get to and wick up to the system. So there's water built right in to the system already. And then maybe here, this part of it would be the pond section. So now I have I have an herb spiral set up with the water requirements built into it. Another thing that the herb spiral needs is that herb spirals are really sensitive to grass encroachment. So maybe over here we can make, well, I'll make the lawn right here. So here's the lawn. And right there, I want to make sure that I have some kind of a barrier or maybe fortress plants or a nurse log, and I'm edging to keep the lawn away from the herb spiral, because the biggest reason why herb spirals die is the lawn takes over them. Because if the herb spiral is touching grass and grass gets into it, because then the grass runs through all the bricks or the urbanite, and it's impossible to weed it out, and it can be a real problem. So making sure when you build the herb spiral that it's protected from the grass is a really important thing. Now, I think it also needs some sort of a fertility system. So maybe another thing that we can do with the herb spiral, especially down here, this bottom layer is the layer that's really going to need the fertility. So maybe I'm going to build a vermicomposting tube or a worm tube into the lowest layer of the herb spiral, so that there is a good source of nutrients right from the kitchen, right here, built into the herb spiral. I'm not going to worry about fertilizing this layer up here. The nutrients will wick up there enough for those lighter feeders in the dry soil. Things like oregano or things like lavender don't need a ton of fertility. Oh yeah, I see that question. I'll get to it in a second. So again, whenever we build a new thing like this, we should always be thinking of integrating in all of the needs for it. So then it becomes really low maintenance. The herb spiral is already hyper diverse and filled with aromatic herbs, so it's not going to need much in the way of pest prevention. And if it's densely planted, it probably won't need anything for weeds either. Maybe having some good chop and drop plants for mulch next to it would be good, but it probably won't even need that much. So yeah, it's a great question. And if we do this sort of thing right, and we make sure each step of our transformation process is whole and has this kind of integrity, then we can conquer the world, right? This is how we conquer the world. We do one thing, get it right so it requires very little maintenance and lasts a long time. Then we can move on to the next project and the next project and the next project. That is how you really transform a landscape, right? That's what I've seen. Going to the chat, I see some questions there on how would you adapt an herb spiral for a patio with a concrete bottom? You know, I don't think that that's necessarily a problem at all. You might even still be able to do a small little bowl pond, just using like a kitchen bowl as a pond. You'd simply be building it up a little bit more instead of digging it into the ground. I've seen people do it, and it can work. It can work absolutely just fine. It's like building an herb spiral on a raised bed. I think you can do that. I think you know, it's definitely a thing that can work. Okay, yeah, that was a great question and gets into a lot of the things we're talking about. At the end of this class, we're going to get into systems thinking and system theory more. So it was a great little start to that. All right, where were we at? Look at some more patterns here. Okay, back to some patterns. What is that? this one is a set of neurons. But again, it looks very much like mycelial pattern. Imagine that. And again, just showing these sort of fractals that we see. We're going to look at a little bit of a fractal video in a second. Where did it go? So, yeah, let's look at this. I'm going to see if I can make this work. I'd like to. Are you familiar with the Mandelbrot set? In this slideshow, I have. Oh yeah, I'll make sure you have that. Let's see, where's the slideshow link? Okay. Oh, thank you. Yep, there's the slideshow. I'm having a little bit of trouble opening here. So are you familiar with the Mandelbrot Fractal? I really like looking at this one. It has a lot of interesting real world applications too. I'm going to see if I can. Oh, you know what? We're going to come back to that due to the third part of class, because I just realized I have to set something up in order to do it. But that's fine. We're going to do it because it'll be fun to look at. But just looking through here too, we see that we can copy patterns like this one, which was a design I did for a client. And I like to show things like this too, because when I did the design for the client, there were like several different layers of the actual design. I did them with colored pencils and watercolor, and the guy framed them. And I made sure that the cover one was really gorgeous, and then the others were very informal like this. I like to point this out because you don't necessarily have to use fancy equipment in order to do this kind of design for people in a way that they will like it. So people, I will offer people both. And usually people will choose that they would rather have something like this made by me than something that I made on a computer, which makes me kind of happy. So I would rather work this way too. But if somebody wants me to do something on a computer, I'll do it. These days, the last couple of times I've done designs on a computer, it's been because the client was like corporate, or I did some designs for Habitat for Humanity houses. And of course they wanted something on a computer too. So otherwise, most of my people clients just get things like this. And it's fantastic to be able to use these sorts of patterns. We'll talk a lot about nature patterns for paths in our path design class in about a month. These days, I usually use, Cassie, I've been using primarily Adobe, the Adobe Creative Suite. So I have access to Adobe Creative Suite, so that is what I've been using. I will usually take maps from local maps and process them using like Adobe. In one of the future classes, I'll actually show you how to do this. And I'm making, yeah. So now I'm going to make a set of different plants and gardens that you can use for design. So if you have an app that you're using that can just use little plant GIFs, then and garden GIFs, and import them, then I'll be able to, in the tools folder for this class, for the program, the professionals tools, there's now a whole folder of these tools, and it's going to grow much bigger over the next few months. So hopefully that'll be something that people will want to use. You know, a lot of the programs I find aren't very good for what I want to do as a permaculturist. So hopefully we'll be able to have some tools that will be much better tools for the kinds of things that we permaculturists want to make. Just more fractal patterns. We're going to talk a lot about these a lot when we're talking about paths. But you can see these kinds of things on, yeah, exactly. So we really need to, and to do things like, they're very good at making linear sets of plants, but if we're doing things like bio-intensive spacings and grid spacings, then that doesn't work really for what we're going for at all. So there are a lot of ways we need some better tools for permaculture designs, and I think we're starting to get some of those. So, and the implementation. So again, here's a case where we had, this is the start of it. This garden looks so cool now. I need updated pictures for you. But again, having the basic design allows this sort of generative process of putting down the stones and creation. And this garden has evolved a lot over a couple of years. It's a client of mine in Kalamazoo. And of course, we see that pattern here. Okay, we're going to return to talk about Mandelbrot fractals in a little bit. What I'd like to do is a little bit of an activity. And on the idea of pattern language and pattern thinking. Because if you think about it this way, if pattern languages are a research-based way to solve a problem and create better things and design better, then pattern thinking becomes like a form of genius in a way. If, you know, a lot of us who get exposed to permaculture, we see people like Bill Mollison, and you see him talk, or Jeff Lawton, and they seem like geniuses. Why? Why do these guys seem like they know so much stuff? The reason why is they've been doing decades of pattern thinking. So what do we do with a pattern language and pattern thinking? We start a pattern language, and a pattern always starts with a problem. So just as we did for this class, I want you to have a problem that you're solving for my class, right? So a pattern design process always starts with a problem. Then we look for patterns to solve the problem, and we compile a bunch of patterns together and then play with those, right? This makes you kind of a genius because if you look at what Jeff Lawton has done, Jeff Lawton has spent decades going around to people, literally asking them, what are your problems on your landscape? Then he has looked for patterns and compiled them together to solve those problems. So whenever someone asks Jeff a question, what do you do about this? Jeff can spit out a bunch of patterns that will potentially solve that problem because of this way of thinking. And if you want to become very useful and have a lot of wisdom about what to do in an area, this kind of thinking, pattern thinking, is a great way of getting there. I'd like to show you a little bit of an exercise about how powerful this pattern thinking is. So I'd like to, let's see how many people we got here live. We got enough people to do this as a live thing. I don't think we have enough people today to necessarily do it in groups. So what I'd like to do is maybe take, let's see, I'm trying to think of whether or not to do this as a group thing. Maybe we'll come back and do it as a group, but I'd like to give you 10 minutes to do an activity really quick. And then we'll come back and talk about it. So the first thing I have here for you is another folder. So in today's folder, if you already have that open, there is a set of slides on here called pattern exercises. And if I could make a suggestion, Zach, you might want to open one of these and kind of try to do this exercise on your channel, if you would. I think it would be a really interesting thing to try to do if you have the ability to do that. Just to show people how great this sort of pattern thinking is. So the folder I just dropped for you has 4 excerpts. It has 2 excerpts of chapters from the Permaculture Designer's Manual, and it has 2 chapters on my book, from my book. So I'd like to invite you to choose one. The 2 chapters from the Designer's Manual are on Humid Tropics and Drylands. And my book chapters, oh, I can't remember what they are. You'll have to open them up and take a look. What I'd like you to do is pick one. And if you'd like something potentially easier, my book follows Christopher Alexander's pattern language concept much more explicitly than Bill Mollison's work did. He was inspired by it, but he kind of did his own thing too. So mine might be slightly easier to do this with, but the Designer's Manual you can do it with too. In fact, you can do it with any book. You could grab any book and do this activity. So using patterns to think and communicate. So first, open up one of the excerpts from the folder. The first thing I want you to do is make a determination. What is the problem? What is the thing addressed by the chapter? So, for example, if you were looking at a chapter, I'll actually do one in a second for you if you like. I'll do one on the Alternative Global Nations chapter. I'll do this in a second. Next, I'd like you to quickly skim the chapter, looking at the pictures, titles, and infographics. And what I'm specifically asking you to do is think about patterns. What are the patterns that solve the problem? So first, we're always thinking, what is the problem being addressed? Next, what are the patterns that are being used to solve the problem, or that can be applied to solve the problem? Then next, go back and one time really quickly kind of skim through the pages and try to answer about how many major patterns are there, and then try to say, try to memorize some of them. What are the patterns that are being given to solve the problem? And keeping in mind, we can read any textbook this way. And if you get in the habit of reading textbooks this way, you will do way better in all of your classes, I guarantee you. This is a way I was taught to read textbooks, and it's really powerful if you've never been taught this and you never do this. So I would like you to see that. And so what I'm asking you to do, just from memory here, by the way, I pretty much have, because I've read it in this way, I pretty much have the entire Designer's Manual memorized in this sort of way. I can tell you what the chapters are, because they're all patterns for solving the problem of creating a sustainable society. And I can pull out one of the patterns, like, I can tell you there, it starts with the introduction, methods in design, then pattern understanding, where we're at today, trees and their energy interactions. Then we go into humid tropics, drylands, and we go through other climates. There's sections on comparative climate design, machine use, and then towards the end we get into a section on the famous Alternative Global Nations chapter. So pulling out one of those, the Alternative Global Nations chapter, I could say, what's the problem? It's how can we use permaculture to create a more just and sustainable society? Then it goes through in gives a large collection of patterns. The big ideas are finance, looking at how we bank and spend our money, patterns for that. Looking at community finance, it offers patterns like LETs and time banking, things like that. And then it talks about organizing structures. Our work of creating bioregional organizations, things about how those might be structured. So I could go on and on, but just this is the basic idea. Look at what the pattern is and what are the patterns that are recommended to solve that problem. I'm going to give you 10 minutes to maybe look at one of these chapters and try to do that. And when we come back, I'd like a few of you at least, I know not everybody's on here, but I'd like a few of you to maybe give a shot at summarizing one of these chapters for us. Sound good? Any thoughts, questions, comments about that? It's a good activity. Always makes people feel like they're really smart. Okay, I won't make anyone go too, so just so you know. But let's take our second, and I'll give you more break too, but let's take 10 minutes. We'll come back at 7:47 after taking a look through one of those chapters. All right? Okay.
All right, let me get this out of the way 1 second. So if you want to do the activity along with us, I linked that in the chat there. I can link it once again. There it is. Let me see if I can just highlight it and reshare it in case that's a little easier. Actually, we'll go back to the thing and get that link once more. All right. So if you want to do the activity, here's the link to the Google Drive for that. And I think I'm going to... Oh, yeah. Yeah, it can be a kind of a daunting task, just coming into the middle of it. Basically, what he wants us to do is to take one of it's just like one page out of the 4 that are linked in that particular link there, and skim through it, and first of all answer, what's the problem addressed by this chapter? Just give it, there's no wrong answers really. It's just what are you getting from it? And then go back and skim it again and say how many patterns are given, and then go back one final time and say what are the patterns, and answer those questions. So that's the idea of the activity. Oops. Back here. All right. So I'm going to open it up for myself here. I think I'm probably going to do, let's do the chapter 10, the Humid Tropics. And I can just go ahead and read it to y'all because it's, oh, actually it is the whole thing. I thought it was only a page or 2. Anyway, so in this chapter, this is from Permaculture, a Designer's Manual, which is kind of the foundational text of permaculture as a design science. It was written by Bill Mollison, and it kind of just goes through and lays out very systematically basically all the ideas, all the strategies used to do things in a permaculture way to set up well, it focuses on a homestead basically, but this could be applied to an urban area. It could be applied to anything that you need to design. It's all applicable to basically any sort of design. So this one's on the Humid Tropics. So it starts by saying the subsets of climate zones included in this chapter specifically exclude arid tropics, which are included in chapter 11. Okay. Together with cold arid areas. So we're kind of focusing in on what this chapter is going to be talking about, specifically the specific biome that this applies to. As plants and techniques do not split off neatly into climatic areas, the following 3 chapters should be read in total for any one site. Okay, so what that means is basically wherever you are, it's not going to neatly fit into, well, this is, the arid savanna, or this is the temperate woodlands. There's going to be some degree of variation between these very broad concepts of biomes. So there's one pattern that we're looking at. We're looking at the broad patterns of the tropical or the humid tropics. So this would be places like, you could even include, the bottom part of Florida in this. That's technically subtropical, but it's very humid, gets a lot of rain. So the strategies for managing a homestead are going to revolve around those sorts of factors. So it goes into climatic types. There's the wet tropics. These are the river basins and wet coasts from not Latin, but latitudes 0 to 25 degrees. So this is the heart of the tropics. Major localities in the Amazon and Congo basins, Central America, Sri Lanka, so on and so forth. This climate covers about 10% of the Earth's surface. 5% of the human population is included in this. It is heavily occupied only where terraced, alkaline, volcanic soils enable sustained cultivation, such as in Java. It contains remnant tribes of hunter-gatherers, often pygmoid, I don't know what that word means, in remnant forests, and is rapidly being ruined by overexploitation of forests, mining, and extensive cattle rearing. This trend continues on until today, even though I believe this came out in the 80s, this book. Hence, there's a recent tendency for catastrophic wildfires to develop in logging areas, such as Borneo, and for soils to be leached to low fertility. An interesting note about these sort of tropical areas is you would think that with so much lush vegetation, with so many things growing all packed in together, that it would be the most fertile soil you could ever imagine. But actually the opposite is true. All of that fertility, all those nutrients get sucked up into every living thing, every living plant that has a root into the soil. So the soils themselves are not where the fertility lies. It's within the plants themselves. So when you clear cut these sorts of areas and you say put in pasture land for cattle, oh boy, got a hair in my mouth, sorry. You're clear cutting it to put in like pasture land for cattle. That's a very low quality soil to begin with. And now you're trying to grow new plants on it, new grasses, and that's a big contributing factor to a pattern of erosion and just further degradation. And it doesn't take that long before that land is completely used up and has super low fertility. That's what he's talking about. So there's another pattern. Overexploitation in foresting, mining, cattle rearing, all these sorts of things. These are patterns that affect this landscape. So these are things you need to take into consideration if we're going to go in the opposite direction, try and regenerate the land, bring back the dynamic, vibrant ecology that once was in these places. Another pattern that you might see in this sort of an area is having multiple layers to the forest canopy. So you have an overstory, the highest, tallest trees. In places like South America, that's often the Brazil nut. It's like 150, 200 feet tall. Towers above everything. Very important keystone crop or species. A lot of animals depend on the Brazil nut. And then you can have even up to like 3 different layers of the forest. You can have the understory, which is the stuff that's just underneath. And then you have these smaller plants. And then you have spots that are just waiting for an area in the forest to open up, to grow back up. Oh, sorry. Missed a few comments there. Can you throw me a link? You can. I have a Discord. Let me pull that up real quick for you. So that's where I send all the links to, just to keep the chat safe, because it's just me. I don't want to have a bunch of people coming in here and spamming links that could harm people's computers if they click on them, because I don't usually have too many mods in here or anyone else really watching the chat. So I just send everything to the Discord. I find that's a good way to be able to still have people share things while at the same time. Yeah, keeping the chat safe. Oh, it looks like we're going to start back up again.
I'm going to kind of feel free to continue looking at whatever you're looking at. I'm going to kind of do one of my own. I looked at this book right here, Beauty and Abundance. It's probably cheating, but and I looked at the chapter on paths, and it looked like the problem that it wanted to solve is that paths can be one of the biggest problems of maintenance and work in the garden. And so having good patterns for path layout can be high impact for reducing the work that we do. Well, that sounds good. So some of the patterns, there were about a dozen patterns, which is a lot to remember in just a short amount of time. But some of the patterns involved are having hard and clean edges, which means allowing some areas to be a little messier, using path hierarchies. And path hierarchies, turns out, looks a lot like these fractal patterns we're talking about. Using different types of paths and different materials for different applications in the garden to make sure that we're using the ones that are the most effective for each part of the garden. Path and node design and keyholes were another pattern in it. Then there were some patterns for like walkable ground covers, grass mixes, and things like that. Those are the main patterns that I remember for solving the problem of how to make easier, better paths in the garden. So again, this idea of using patterns and communicating in them allows us to communicate a lot of information about a topic in a short amount of time. If someone were to ask me, what are some things I have a problem with my paths, what do I do? A lot of times we will offer answers that are like, suppose there's only one answer. Well, what you have to do is get cardboard down on them, and then wood chip mulch, and then that'll solve the problem, right? So that's the kind of answer we usually give. When we think in patterns, it allows us to understand there could be 12 different ways to solve this problem. And it's a matter of finding the one that's going to match the circumstance best. It doesn't mean that wood chips and cardboard are the best pattern for everyone. It means we think creatively and list these patterns with the person and choose the one that works best for that person. That's a totally different way of giving advice to people. And it's a much higher value thing for a consultant to provide than just saying, just get some newspaper and wood chips. All right. Would anyone like to chime back in and talk about whatever chapter or a chapter they looked at? Hopefully someone's out there still. Could be people are still doing the activity. No worries. I see people are coming back. If anyone would like to take a second to, no worries, Cassie, of course. If anyone would like to give an example of summarizing a chapter in patterns, I'd love to hear it. And I'll also say too, while while people are looking at it, great, Zach. And while people are looking at it, I'll say this is a great activity to do with people too, in a group. If you do this with people, you'll be amazed. You'll see different groups of people can take a different chapter and work on it together. And I find this to be actually kind of more fun and constructive than doing a traditional like reading group or reading circle. Instead, you sit around with people and you ask the question, what's the problem this author is looking at in this chapter? And then everyone picks through and picks out some of the patterns and discusses those patterns that the person is doing. And it turns it into a real discussion. It's a great way to look at material in a short way as an activity. Today, we didn't quite have enough people to make it work as an activity, a small group activity for us. Usually when I do this, this is how I do this as a small group activity. But I still think there's some value to it. I'd like to hear what you came up with, if anyone would like to go. Thank you, Zach, for telling us a bit about the humid tropics. Yeah. Yep. So you can see again, Molson was really thinking of this kind of way. Look at a problem, name a bunch of patterns that are appropriate to the problems of the circumstance. I think that's one of the reasons why the designer's manual has had such lasting power for so many people. Anybody else feel like giving it a go? I said I wouldn't necessarily make anyone, so.
Sure. I just did the very first chapter of your book, and it looks like the problem is just how to start a garden bed. And the patterns were double dig, sheet mulching, hugelcultures, herb spiral, and planting into resident vegetation.
Yep, just like that. And so, again, just ends up being a really great way to interact with people who are like clients or asking for advice. Instead of, people say, how do you start a garden using permaculture? Instead of just thinking there's one answer, sheet mulch, we can compile a bunch of patterns that solve that problem and work with the person to do them. As we do this kind of work with people, connecting with people really over what their problems are and being creative about compiling patterns that help them solve the problem, this really becomes like an amazing education for us. And it's just a great kind of process and a great way to grow. And it also makes the process of being a consultant and a designer much more rewarding too. It's all about exploration, not, together. It's about mutual exploration, and instead of about like telling people what to do. All right, well, thank you for playing along with my little exercise. I hope you felt like you got something out of that. And a lot of people who do my PDC say that this is something that they stick with and continue to do as they pick up new books. I read pretty much every book this way. I skim pretty much every book looking for what the big problems are that the book is written to address, and what are the kinds of patterns that they're looking at. Then I go back and fill in the details. That reminds me of something. And I shared the link with you in the chat of a YouTube video. I'm going to try to give it a look right now together before we take another break together. Okay. Let's see if this works. Oh, there we go. So this is an interesting little fractal equation called the Mandelbrot set. And the Mandelbrot set is basically a number, an equation that yields an infinite number of repetitions. And when we graph them, it's an amazing thing that appears, because if you take any single segment of this set of numbers, of this pattern, and look at it, it will look like it's made up of this pattern again and again and again. You could take any single point of it and zoom in, and it would be made of an infinite number of this pattern. So, and then you could take another point of that and blow it up, and it would be made of another infinite number of this pattern again. Mandelbrot was really interested in how we can quantify things like a seashore. How do you measure a seashore? Because you could say, as a straight line, linear, it's 10 miles. But really, the seashore looks like this, right? So maybe if you measure all of the different angles to it, it looks like it's 100 miles long. But then if you get on it on foot and you walk it, you can see there's even more detail to it. So now it's maybe 1,000 miles of seashore. But then if we look really close at, say, a grain of sand, we could see that the grain of sand itself has infinitely more different shapes to it. And if there's an infinite number of grains of sand, it's a very long seashore. So looking at these Mandelbrot sets allows us to have a language to describe things that are infinite, like a seashore. Let's take a look. This one, if you play it, it's lovely because it's set to Beethoven. It'll probably play a little less choppy on your device than mine. I'm just going to keep talking. If you're listening to the Beethoven, that's lovely too. But it's just kind of neat to see we can pick. Here we are, zooming in on one small little part of the Mandelbrot set. And everything that you're looking at right now, there's a big one, but everything that you're looking at is an infinite number of tiny little versions of this Mandelbrot monster. And it just goes on and on. Here's another one. And if you look at the edges, all of the edges are, again, infinite numbers of more Mandelbrots. And this is kind of like our process of learning and growth as people. As we start to look at something like permaculture, we start out looking at the big topics, the big patterns, and then we start to zoom in and get a little bit more detail and fill out that detail. And then we can look in even further and fill out even more detail. When we learn in this way, all of our learning, all of our information has a scaffolding that we can organize it with. We understand what problems the learning solves. It's not just abstract anymore. It's something that solves specific problems for us. And then we have a tendency to remember things better. So, and we communicate better with people too, because then we're really looking at what their problems are. We can start with the big view and then get more and more detail about how to solve their problems as we zoom in. And every time we do this pattern of exploration, we grow in our knowledge and our understanding of the complexities of these topics. It's a beautiful way to think about human learning. If I were to look inside your brains, what I'd see might look a lot like this. I'll share in the Facebook group some more videos and some interviews about Mandelbrot, creating the Mandelbrot set, if you're interested in this. So it's a really interesting little application of math. Anyone have thoughts, questions, comments about fractals and the Mandelbrot? Let's take a look real quick at a couple more before we take a break. So there are a lot of interesting numbers like this that all have applications in the real world once we start measuring things like plant growth and shorelines and edge effects. This one's interesting because, as you see, to make this, you draw a triangle, and then you, at each point, you add another triangle. And then at each point, you add another triangle. And you can continue this on infinitely. And what you end up with is an image that looks very similar to the first two, that's made of an infinite number of more little triangles like this. And it just goes on and on forever. And this is the Murder carpet. And it's the same exact thing. It starts with the symbol on the top left, but we can go on and on and on, building more and more murder carpet. And it goes on and on. And if we turn it into a 3D image, then we can make a cube of it and make a murder cube. And the amazing thing about this is, look, it looks like it's there. But you could build one of these as large as the galaxy, and it would have almost no mass. Because any single part of that you were to drop a pin on would be space. It would be made of an infinite number of more little murder cubes, just like this. And it would go on and on forever. So if you dropped a pin at this, the pin would just fall right through it. So interesting patterns, and interesting to see that these are the sorts of things that nature is actually made up of. We think that we're pretty solid and we're made of matter, but in a lot of ways, we're just space. All right, we're going to come back in a few minutes. We're going to take one more break. We're going to come back and we're going to talk about the biggest pattern of all, the patterns of patterns and how they interact together, which is called a system. We're going to talk about systems as patterns and how to find leverage points for massive system change. When we talk about systems, we're talking about everything. What are some systems? Your garden is a system. Your body is a system. Your brain is a system. Education is a system. You could consider your shoes a system if you like, especially when they're attached to your feet. The economy is a system. A farm is definitely a system, and all businesses are systems. And we're going to start talking and introducing some ideas about how we can manage systems better using some design and transformation. All right, we'll do that when we come back. Let's start again at, why don't we say, we'll still do 10 minutes because it's 8:05. Let's make it 8:15. We'll come back. We'll talk about systems theory. All right, thanks.
Okay. So a lot of trippy stuff there at the end of this segment. Oh, the link didn't show. Oh, sorry. Let me try it again. I don't know why I have this bot that is supposed to repost stuff across all the different platforms I stream to. It's called Restream Bot. For some reason it hasn't been doing it for Facebook tonight. Let me go find that. So it's called Permaculture in Action. That's the Facebook group. Oh, I'm already on it. Okay, cool. I will set the link out right here for you. acetin, but action. So once more, there's that link for you. That's Mike's group. Mike Hoag is the person who's hosting this talk tonight. This is a part of his permaculture design course. You're welcome, John. Good to see you tonight. How you been? So yeah, what does everyone think so far? And I know this is kind of way outside of entry level stuff at this point. So if you're going, what the heck is going on? Oh, acetin. Did I write it wrong again? In action. Oh yeah, acetin. Tough actin, tenactin. That's right. Anyway, I know that this can be kind of a lot to take in if you're totally new to permaculture. I'm going to go ahead and link again my Permaculture 101 series in case this is feeling a bit overwhelming for you. I've done a whole series on just getting you used to from everything from the very basics into a little bit of the design and theory within permaculture. So let me just link that playlist once more. Where are we? Permaculture 101. So here's that link coming right now in case you feel this is a bit outside your speed and you want to go back and recover some of these ideas. So there it is there. That's my permaculture series, Permaculture 101. Questions are as good as answers. Yeah. So, yeah, patterns are one of the most important parts of permaculture in my estimation. It relates to most of the principles that David Holmgren, one of the co-originators, came up with. It's definitely there in observe and interact. It's there in using value the marginal and use edges. It's on use and value diversity. All these things involve patterns. Like pretty much any permaculture principle in some way or another involves patterns. It's on the interwebs. It's permanent now. Yep. So yeah, if you guys have any questions, if you feel like you're a bit lost, let me know. I'm happy to help get you up to speed in any way that I can, or at least point you in the right direction. Not to overwhelm you with too many different links, but Permaculture Designer's Manual is available online for free. I'm going to find a link for it. Oh, and we're going back to the class. It sounds like I hear some movement. And oh, fungi are indispensable. I don't know if you can still hear the audio from the Zoom while I have it minimized. I guess that's one part of Restream I don't know yet. So hopefully it's not too confusing. But yeah, virtually every plant out there has some sort of relationship, usually a symbiotic relationship with fungi. It's been called the neural network of the forest. You can't do anything without fungi. We'd be lost without it. Yeah. Interesting. Plain oatcakes, huh? Definitely be interested to see how that turns out too. That's cool. Quaker oatcakes, huh? That's cool. Very cool. All right, let's go back to the Zoom call.
Comparable in some ways to the rest of the tissues. And as we zoom in, there are larger branches, and then those get smaller to smaller branches, and then finally the pins at the end. And if we were smart, we would design similar patterns when it talks about moving things around our landscapes. If you look at my book, Beauty and Abundance, I recommend one of those patterns for paths is ordered paths, which means that when we design a garden, we start out looking at we start out looking at the main entrances to the garden. We want to make those large and very durable over a long period of time. As we go up from there, we get smaller sets of branches. So we should have smaller sets of paths as well into the garden. The time we want small working areas and working nodes in the garden. And those, if we keep those small, then we minimize our path materials and our path maintenance time. So when we design a set of paths in the landscape that looks like these nature patterns and fractal patterns, we have designed something that will minimize our efforts and maximize the functionality of the landscape.
Okay, I guess he was just popping in for a little thought there before we get back from our break officially. I'll come back and bring up my camera as the full screen once again. Man, that Stream Elements bot is going a little bit crazy with the prompts there. I'll have to reduce the amount of, or I guess increase the amount of time in between each time it lists that message. But there's my link tree in case anyone's interested in following me on the various platforms I'm on. And, pretty much any social media you can think of, aside from the right-wing ones, you can find me on. Planning on branching out even into LinkedIn, maybe some of the more obscure stuff like Daily Motion and so forth. But we'll see. All right, let's get back to it.
How do you grow your lemon tree? Do you put it out in the summer and bring it in the winter? Do you use a light? Yeah.
Yeah, there are a set of grow lights on it now for the winter, and it's on a south-facing window, so it gets a fair amount of sun. The more sun, the better. And then, yeah, anytime that it gets above like 50 degrees all winter long, whenever there's a day that's above 50 degrees, it goes outside. It does feel like that makes it survive better. And then yeah, just letting it stay outside all summer long, and then bringing it in. And now it's been with me. This lemon tree has been with me now for like 4 years. So, and it's produced a bunch of big crops of lemons, usually in the winter. So usually right around December, I start to get a nice big crop of lemons. That's nice.
That's rad. Yeah. How do you have it? Oh, sorry. Do you have it like on wheels so you can move it, or do you just muscle it out there?
I have thought many times that I should put it on wheels so that I could move it, but I kind of like muscling it around too. I feel like I get a full workout from moving it when I have to move it. A smarter person would put it on
Fair
wheels.
enough. No, that's stacking functions. Get your exercise in too. I dig it.
Yeah. And behind me, I am finally, so a lot of things like this I dry during the season, and I then come back this time of year and finally sort them. I've got dried things around here still unsorted that I need to finally put into packages. They've been hanging someplace where they're mostly, pretty dust free. This is sugar. It's stevia. So I absolutely love growing stevia. So I think I'll have my next year's seeds on here too, on some of them. And, big bowl of stevia left to process. Anybody else have interesting garden projects at this time of year going on?
I'm trying to overwinter a tropical plant that we started too late in the garden last year it's called solanum, and in Spanish it's coconillo, and it's an edible fruit that's like got a hairy little orangish yellow fruit to it. And we got a late start, but the plants were like really vigorous and loving it. So we're trying to overwinter them and hoping we might get fruit next summer.
Oh, cool. Wow, and ginger is cool too. I've never tried to grow ginger. I sure love ginger. I mean, I grow the local native ginger, but I've never tried to grow actual ginger. That's pretty cool. Most seasons, I always still have, I'm really big on cellar forcing. So while I was doing Lily House, I had salads through most of the winter from forcing. And in fact, I think I'm going to try to do my next actual farm business. I always have little farm businesses too. My next one is going to be, I think I'm going to call it Hades greens or something like that. Because when you cellar force, everything is, grown in the dark. And so everything is blanched. So the vegetables look really weird. But I feel like, I was just at the farmer's market this week, and, there's like one person doing microgreens, but nobody's doing cellar forcing. And imagine taking into the farmer's market in a place like Indiana in January and showing up with fresh asparagus and poke and greens and things like that. There's so many great things you can cellar force, and they don't require a greenhouse. They don't require additional heating. You can grow them in a cool basement with no extra lighting or heating or energy. So it's just an amazing way to do things. And I kind of do feel like us permaculturists have emphasized greenhouses and plastics a little too much for climate extension and winter produce. And we haven't emphasized cellar forcing enough, because most of my winter produce over the last few years has come from cellar forcing, and it doesn't require any of the things that a greenhouse requires. So, and watercress. I love having bowls of watercress around, but this year I do not have any cellar forcing pots to show you. This is the first year I haven't done that in probably about 10 years. Anybody else play around with that? If you're not familiar with it, the way it works is you grow perennials. Asparagus is a great one to do, because asparagus crowns you have to thin, right? You get a big old asparagus crown, you got to thin that. You can take half your asparagus crown, put it into a pot, and fill it with sand, maybe a little compost, but it doesn't need nutrients. It has all the nutrients it needs already stored up in the roots. So you take it and you put it in a pot and you leave it outside in the snow, and nothing happens. But when you want asparagus, you bring it inside and you put it in a cold, dark spot in the basement. Then it thinks it's spring, and boom, it sends up asparagus. Only there's no light, so it's blanched asparagus. And usually you can get a few cuttings out of that before it gives up the ghost. You can do that with weed chicory too. Just roadside weed chicory will cellar force amazing greens, and a lot of them will be like the Chicorium endivum, the Belgian endive, and like around here, if you can find those, they tend to cost like $5 a head. Well, that's $5 that you could make out of a weed, and one weed might grow 3 of those in the course of a winter. That's a $15 weed that you're growing in the dark in your basement. So cellar forcing is just a great thing to do. Yeah, I know he does that too. It's a great technique. All right, let's get back.
Stephen Barstow.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, Stephen Barstow does a lot of cellar forcing, and he cellar forces dandelions.
I do too.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're almost indistinguishable from Belgian endive.
Yeah. And I imagine, I mean, this is just a theory of mine, that celery root, like you could buy one at the supermarket and it'll start growing. And you could cellar force that because it'll freeze if you put it outside. I've done it, it's frozen.
Yeah. Yes, it does lose relative nutrition, Zach. So if you take something, because a lot of the nutrients, especially like a lot of the things that we want for something like a dandelion, a lot of the minerals come from are wrapped up in the chlorophyll making process, and the photosynthesis process. So if you are getting blanched vegetables, then they do not have as much mineral content as like a leafy green dandelion. But it's still a dandelion. It still probably has more nutrients in it than most lettuce, from what I've seen. And the chlorophyll is actually, that process is what makes the bitter chemicals, the bitter compounds too. So when you cellar force a dandelion, you get crisp, blanched white, crispy white greens, white yellow greens, and or white yellow leaves, and they're crispy and they're sweeter and not as bitter. So they do lose some nutrients, but they gain a lot of edibility and flavor, and they tend to taste better. So it's a trade-off, and it's probably still better if you want to. You could put them in a sunny south-facing window. If it's something like asparagus and you feel like the asparagus would have more nutrients if it was green instead of yellow, then you can put it in a south-facing window. And it'll grow just the same. But a lot of people consider the taste and texture of the blanched vegetables grown in the dark to be superior, so that's why people do it.
Can I ask about the dandelions? Like, are you literally just digging up weeds from your yard and throwing them in a pot in the basement?
Yep. You dig up the dandelion weeds, you put them in a pot with some sand, leave them outside so they're dormant. And when you want the greens, you bring them in, and usually it takes about 2 or 3 weeks. I'd say 2 weeks. It's a really fast process. Once you bring them inside, 2 weeks later, you'll have a big pot filled with salad. And they're just some of the best greens you can ever have. Blanched dandelion greens are, to me, the best salad green.
Okay, good to know.
Magic, huh? Okay, so let's talk about the pattern of patterns, which is, of course, systems, thinking in systems. So people who study systems and systems thinkers have a basic model of a system that looks like this. So when we talk about systems, systems are things that process energy, or resources. So an organism like meat, I'm a system. Food goes in one side, food energy, inflow, calories, and I stock them, right? And if I stock too many, I get a big belly. And if I stock too few, then, I go the other direction. So this is the basic model for what we're talking about with systems. Now, the thing is, once systems get very complicated, they get really difficult to predict and understand. If we're just talking about your bathtub, this looks like a bathtub, right? So systems people talk about stocks and flows. So this is basic systems theory language, stocks and flows. So we're looking at a stock and flow chart, the simplest stock and flow chart. Later on in this class, we'll probably look at some more, just get some ideas of thinking in systems better. So if we're talking about a bathtub, it's really easy to understand. If you turn on the faucet and put a stopper in the bathtub, the stock fills up and you have a stock of water. You pull the plug and it flows out. So we could talk about regulating these stocks and flows. It's a pretty simple process. But if we're talking about a person, it's true, we could say that the stock and flow and our health and everything is about calories in and calories out, how many calories you're eating and how many calories you're burning. But we all know it doesn't really work that way, right? Because we're complex systems. If we get all of our calories in the form of mini muffins, it's going to be different than if we get our calories in the form of produce from our garden. So complex systems don't necessarily behave the way we think they should. So the systems thinker Donella Meadows has written a lot about this, and she was also the author of the Club of Rome report. She was very influential to the early permaculturists and remains influential today. She looked at this, and she was a systems thinker, and she's provided us with some strategies for more efficiently affecting complex systems, like our gardens, by the way. Our gardens are systems, and the more we can think in systems in our gardens, the more effective we'll be in our gardens as well. So let's take a look at Donella Meadows' leverage points for changing systems. And I'm just going to point out here, this is my sort of simplification of her system. If you want the full thing, it's right here. We're going to look at this later. I'm just in the course. For now, we're going to keep it nice and simple, right? Fractal learning. The first time through, we're going to get a bigger picture, and later we're going to get more detail as we develop this. So, Donella Meadows pointed out that there are 4 basic ways we can change systems. And the problem is, we often focus on the ones that have the least potential for change. So this graphic shows us we have some points that are high leverage points that will cause a lot of change. But as you can see, the bar is way up high, so it's hard to reach. You have to think about how to reach it. You need like a ladder or something. You got to get a pole and hit that lever up there, right? So the high leverage points cause a lot of change, but they're harder to figure out how to deal with. They take more planning. Down at the bottom, I have brute force. That is really hard to make any change. It's easy to figure out how to grab it there, but we don't have the leverage to cause any real change. So the main idea here is that we have some high leverage points and poor leverage points. Most of the time, we focus on the low leverage points instead of the high ones. Because Donella Meadows was interested in society change, she often gave the idea or the example of poverty. So let's start with Donella Meadows' example of poverty. She said, usually in our society, when we go about thinking about changing the problem of poverty, what we start with is like measuring. Brute force is tracking and changing the resources, looking at the stocks and flows in different ways. For example, we want to track how many poor people we have, what are their incomes, what is the income distribution, looking at all these numbers. Our government and our society spends a lot of money and time doing exactly that, measuring those things. But you'll notice that does not actually change the issue of poverty at all. To do that, we have to start changing something. So down here on the brute force area, that means directly changing the resources. For example, taking money from some people and giving it to other people, taking money from people who are wealthy and giving it money to people who are lower income. We call that brute force because it almost always involves conflicts, because the rich people don't want to give us their money. So, and it also, so it involves a lot of work to get it done. It's hard to change that. And it has very little change, because what we do is we'll make a very small change to something like taxes, but we'll leave all the big system things in place that create poverty in the first place. So as we move up from there, we could get to behavior change. Maybe change the behavior of wealthy people so that they're not hoarding so many resources. Maybe change the behavior of people who are in poverty to make them maybe more competitive in the system. Maybe make them more revolutionary. As we move up from there, we get to system change. Now we're starting to get things that have a lot of potential leverage, but they're a little bit harder to figure out how to change. But these would be things like changing the whole economic system, for example, right? And finally, we get up to the really strong leverage points, deep change. These are changing our whole societal goals and mindsets and paradigms. So, for example, why do wealthy people hoard wealth? Because they think they need to have a meaningful, beautiful life? Maybe they don't actually need to. Maybe if we could change their mindset so that they didn't think they needed to hoard wealth to prove something to people, maybe they wouldn't create poverty in the first place. So as we move up in here, maybe we could teach people that the true form of wealth is to live in a society where everyone has their needs met, where people's basic needs are met so they can explore art and creativity. We don't have to live amongst poverty and people who are suffering. Maybe that's what real wealth would be like. If we could change that.
Amen.
Yeah, right? And if we could change that, then we wouldn't have to worry about changing income distribution, because the system would change itself. So this is the kind of thinking Donella Meadows is looking at. And we can apply this to everything. We can apply this, for example, to health. A lot of people are concerned about their health. I've been losing weight and getting in shape because that's the way most people think about it, right? People set a goal to lose weight. What do? They focus first on the low leverage points, because Donella Meadows tells us that's where we look to all the time. So what do? We start tracking our calories, right? We start tracking how much we're eating. We try to change how much we're eating, try to eat less. And we know for a fact that this almost never works, right? As we move up in leverage points, diets don't usually work. They're low leverage points. They usually don't change, and they cause conflict. Because every time I'm looking at a piece of cake, I'm thinking, do I want to be skinnier or do I want a piece of cake? And so I feel this conflict inside me between skinny and cake. As we move up from there, we can change the behaviors that cause the problems. This gets sophisticated. This is looking at, why am I choosing pieces of cake when it doesn't actually match my values? Am I eating because I'm stressed? Can I find a different way to manage my stress other than eating? So now we're talking about changing our behaviors. If we can do that, we have a much stronger chance of changing our health. As we move up from there, we're talking about changing entire systems. Maybe we realize we're getting all of our food from the grocery store, and we're getting a bunch of processed junk food, right? So we need to change our entire food system. We need to change our stressful behaviors that cause us to stress eat. Now we're getting to real systemic change. If we can change those things and make real changes to our lives in that way, we don't have to worry about losing weight anymore, right? Which leads us to the final strongest thing, changing our whole mindset about it. We don't actually want to just lose weight. We're wasting time in tracking our calories in and out and trying to do this. What we really want is to be healthier, right? We could change our whole mindset about what it means to have a good life, finding ways to be healthy that are joyful for us. If we can do those things, we don't have to waste our time and our energy dieting or worrying about eating another mini muffin, right? But this is not usually the way we think about things. But if we can move from low leverage points to high leverage points, we'll be more effective in making change. So let's focus in on this and bring it to the garden. If I can, I'm stuck. Here, let's see if I can go one more. Oh, I know how to do this. Okay. Oh, that's losing weight. Here's one. Oh, so I have two more on here, which is farming and looking at soils, but let's not look at that actually. Let's go back to here and let's talk together about water in the garden. So if we're thinking about watering the garden, what would be some examples of brute force methods we use to think about irrigation and watering the garden?
Hauling 5-gallon buckets and watering by hand.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, look at the plants, you say, oh, they need to be watered, and then you go grab the 5-gallon bucket to deliver the resource to the plants. That's definitely a brute force method. It definitely involves conflict. Noah, yeah?
Sprinkler systems on a timer.
Yeah, a sprinkler system on a timer. A lot of times, well, we know that a sprinkler system causes overhead watering. It gets on the leaves of the plants. It causes the plants to have mold and mildew. So it causes a lot of problems again, and it doesn't solve the problem of watering well for us. So definitely that's a lower leverage point to me.
And dams and bringing water in from far away to water the golf courses in Tucson, Arizona.
Oh, yeah. If we're talking about societal water, we use a lot of brute force methods to get water to where we think it needs to go in our society. It's incredibly wasteful and inefficient, and it causes conflict.
Yeah.
Those are good examples. Let's move up. Focusing back in on a small thing, the garden. I like that we can also blow it up to the societal level, but let's look at the garden for a second. What about behavioral change? What are some behavioral changes we can make to address watering in the garden?
Deep mulch so you don't have to water as often.
Yes, boom, that's a good one. Yeah, you change the behavior there. Use deep mulch instead.
And choice of where you plant things too.
Yeah, that's in a way changing the behavior of the, in fact, that might even be getting up to system change, somewhere between behavior and system change, right? We're no longer, planting plant plants that need water where there's water. Plant the plants that don't need water where there's no water. Now there is a much bigger change. Any others on here? Let's move on.
Timing of watering, like don't water when the sun at 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Yes, don't water, pay attention to your timing. Don't water when it's all going to evaporate, right? Another thing with that could be watering in ways where the water goes directly down into the soil by the plants instead of just sloshing the water all over the whole garden, right? Get the water right down into the soil next to the plants where it can be used instead of just splashing water all over the place. Another great behavioral change. Another great one with that is the bucket method. Instead of hauling the 5-gallon buckets around like for a tree, what you can do is have one bucket under a tree with holes under it. You poke holes in the bucket, you fill up the bucket and let the water slow soak in by the tree. So it all goes down slowly into the soil instead of all running off and just evaporating. So those are behavior changes. How about, Noah?
The wicking beds?
Yes, now I think we're definitely getting up into a system change, right? We've changed the whole idea. We no longer have to water the garden. We've created a garden that will water itself. Another example of that might be swales again. We've changed the whole concept. We're now designing systems that water themselves so we don't have to do it. That's much bigger change. In fact, that's kind of getting into deep change, isn't it? Creating whole systems where water is seen as a precious resource, and our goal is to soak the water in and steward it, and to use it for productivity while it's there. So we create a system of zones where we have some plants that require a lot of water, and those get the water, and we have dryland areas that don't need water, and those take care of themselves. And we use swales and wicking beds and all these together as a system. And now we have eliminated the need to water altogether from the garden in a lot of cases. At Lily House, the garden required, for the last few years, it literally never required irrigation to keep the plants alive. I did no irrigation other than in the spring watering in seedlings sometimes, and rarely did I even do that. So why? Because of a behavior change. I got into the habit of planting plants when I was expecting rain. So at that point, that whole garden required no watering because of this kind of thinking. It's very different than the brute force methods that we tend to focus on. Let's do one more. Because this is such a powerful sort of exercise, how about weeding? What would be brute force approaches to weeding?
Weed.
Yeah, you see the number of weeds, you want less, you go and you pull them out. That's pretty much the main brute force method that we would use. Other brute force methods might include spraying or tilling and things like that, spraying them. But hopefully we're not doing that. What about behavior change?
Eat the weeds.
Eat the weeds. They're no longer weeds at all. They're part of the garden. They're part of food. You mentioned mulch before. Mulch can be another behavior change that will dramatically change the number of weeds we have.
Fortress plants.
Fortress plants. Yeah, now we're getting into systems change, creating gardens like systems with deep mulch and fortress plants and edging so that they don't produce as many weeds. Yeah, Creeping Charlie, it's hard to use Creeping Charlie too. I will have some tips eventually for you about Creeping Charlie too. Creeping Charlie is really interesting in what it does with with soil hydration. So Creeping Charlie sustains itself by making soil hydrophobic. So it's a very interesting plant in that it produces waxy exudates that make the soil hydrophobic, and it allows the creeping Charlie to outcompete other things. Well, if we can beat the creeping Charlie at its game and make habitat that is hydrophilic, that will love and soak up and glob onto the water, other things tend to outcompete the creeping Charlie, and it doesn't like that. So we can have a whole systemic approach to creeping Charlie as well. And Noah?
What would be a systems change to taking care of garlic mustard?
Well, my philosophy on it is, and it might be somewhat of a system and behavioral change. Garlic mustard has been found in studies to reduce in populations when we attack it less. Yes, behavior change true is definitely eating it. Garlic mustard can be really delicious if you get it at the right time. And thinking totally about this deep change idea, we change our whole perspective on what weeds are. We create a system of zones again. We take some plants out that are the plants that are most vulnerable to weeds impacting their growth. We put them in our zone 1 gardens. We use deep mulch, fortress plants, edging. We keep the weeds out of there. We have a weed-free garden for the plants that are vulnerable to weeds. We have another zone that's much wilder with crop plants that are very vigorous and can outcompete weeds. And then we have another area maybe where it's much wilder and the weeds are seen as part of our foraging and our experience there. They're there to provide us with a benefit, so long as they're kept in balance. And we get rid of the whole idea that a weed is a problem simply because it's there. It's only a problem if it's out of balance and causing harm. So does the weed actually have a negative impact where it is, or do we only think it does? These are the kinds of things where we get to really deep change about our weeds. And again, because of this kind of system, at Lily House, I had a tight set of plantings and gardens that really did not ever have weeds in them. Like if you visited, it would be very, very rare to see anything in them that normal people would call a weed, like dandelions or whatever, because there were dense plantings, fortress plantings, deep mulch, there were no weeds. There were other areas where I was growing crops that could coexist with the weeds quite well and without any losses. So there, the weeds weren't really a problem. They were adding biodiversity, adding yields. And to the whole system, the idea became, don't solve the weeding problem with brute force of trying to control and get rid of the weeds. Solve the problem by creating more biodiversity and better systems. Because when we try to do the brute force method to remove the weed, we have worked the weed permanently into the system. If you pull a weed, you have recreated the perfect niche for that weed to come back into again and again and again. If you pull a weed, you're going to have to pull it forever. If you change the problem or solve the problem with your mind, then you've solved it like a Jedi, and you'll never have to solve it again. You've solved it with your mind. So it's a completely different mindset.
And also, Jeff Lawton says that if you cut back the top growth of a plant 3 times, you will kill that plant. So then you can see the weeds as giving you the gift of chop and drop. I mean, it's work, but it's not, it doesn't go on forever.
That is definitely not true with Himalayan blackberry, though. I feel like this is our bane, obviously. And when we moved into our house 4.5-ish years ago, it had been abandoned for a while. So a lot of the backyard was already taken over by blackberry. And I would love to get past the brute force, but if we don't pull them out, they just keep growing, and they are nasty, and they, uh, are painful, and they cause injuries. And yeah, once a year they have good fruit, but blackberry is everywhere here. So we can literally walk across the street and get as much fruit as we could ever possibly need. And we're planting trees, we're trying to shade them out, but in the meantime, before we get some cover, I can't even explain how fast Himalayan blackberry grows and how nasty it is. I don't see us getting past this brute force, honestly, in the next, 10, 20 years, however long it takes to get us like a solid forest cover before it's finally shaded out.
It's a difficult one because it actually does tolerate quite a fair bit of shade. My approach still, if we wanted to try to move out of brute force into some higher method, into some higher leverage points, I would still look at you're doing one thing great already, which is fast forward to a later stage of succession. Change the ecology to an ecology where the blackberry is not going to thrive so much. A second thing might be behavioral, which is whenever you pull the Himalayan blackberry, plant something else in its place. Fill the niche. So
we do that. We always do that. And, they have these huge, like 3-foot long roots. And then, so we've been doing that for a couple of years now. And the problem now is I've noticed wherever we've planted these things, every spring, dozens of little blackberry sprouts pop up right where we pulled out the old one. And so they're coming up right around all the new plants we planted.
Yeah.
Comfrey outcompetes it pretty well. And
You can't plant
especially
a half acre of comfrey though.
Yeah. But I mean, in specific locations, and especially give the comfrey lots of nitrogen.
That's a really good point, is that all of those species, including Himalayan blackberry, will thrive on fungal dominated soils with lower nitrogen. Other things, prairie plants, sun-loving plants, will tend to outcompete it if there's good nitrogen and there's better calcium and more limed sweet soil. If the soil is somewhat acidic and fungal dominated, it's really difficult to outcompete that. But this would be the thing that I would be looking at. I would be looking at terminator guilds. I'd be assembling a terminator guild or terminator guilds in the area that are designed to outcompete. Yeah, sunchokes are extremely allelopathic to almost.
We've already got a huge bed full of sunchokes, believe me.
Yeah, and did the Himalayan blackberry invade them?
No, the sunchokes have left the bed and are invading the rest of the garden.
Oh, see, but
we're not worried about it. I mean,
we have rock, paper, scissors, but the sunchokes are easier to control.
Yeah,
the sunchokes will follow that. If you chop and drop the sunchokes about 3 times, they will eventually die out. The Himalayan blackberry will not.
No.
So if you can outcompete the Himalayan blackberry with terminator guilds of things like monardas and sunchokes to get it under control, and then you can chop and drop the other things, leave it all in place. Any place I pulled it, I would be spot mulching with cardboard. I'd be using a locus that intersect model. So I would focus on one area at a time, get the Himalayan blackberry under control. Like this, here, the picture of me. This area first under control, get it done with terminator guilds, pulling cardboard and mulch down wherever I could, lime the soil to make it less attractive for the Himalayan blackberry, get that locust down. Then maybe add a locust or expand the locust until you keep going and you get it all out of the yard. Making, instead of trying to do brute force on the whole yard all at once, take one piece, transform that one piece, get it stable, move on, expand it. That's the old way of doing that kind of work. And that would be my recommendation. It's a little bit of a different change. It's still going to require some brute force, but we're starting to pull in some behavioral systems and deep change into that at the same time too. Does that seem like a better strategy? And we can develop it more when we get into the guilds class. We'll be looking at things like Terminator guilds specifically, and help you come up with a strategy that will help you transform that Himalayan blackberry problem, at least into not a problem. It might not ever be your best friend.
Yeah, and the comfrey really will, the comfrey will overtake it. And then you'll have, I mean, okay, so then you'll have lots of comfrey for mulch.
We don't want a half acre of comfrey though. Like, we've got comfrey under the fruit trees as, just, as a mulch crop. But I mean, this is out in the back half acre that is now just has mostly little baby trees like pine trees and hazelnut trees and blueberry bushes largely, because that's kind of what we're trying to do back there. And we can't, I mean, it's, it's a half acre. We can't just plant the whole thing in comfrey. And we don't want that much.
But in the smaller areas, I mean, it does a job on it. I mean, but maybe don't want to use it. So
yeah, another system change approach to it, and I know you already have the area somewhat planted, but mowing and grasses, if you can replace that ecology of where the Himalayan blackberry really thrives with a grassland ecology with more bacterial soils and grasses, and that will also completely kick the butt of the Himalayan blackberry. Then you have grass again, so you have another problem to deal with. But it might be one of these rock paper scissors things where you need to change the overall system to get rid of or reduce the Himalayan blackberry. Because I agree, the Himalayan blackberry, if you leave it, will
in a year it takes over.
Yeah, and if your goal is ultimately food forest permaculture system, the Himalayan blackberry will succeed into a deep amount of shade and be there a really long time if you don't prioritize out-competing it with other things. And I really believe that still out-competing it will be more likely to be successful than only using a brute force method. My opinion.
I watched somebody wipe out a comfrey patch with an incredibly deep cardboard sheet mulch, and he grew pumpkins there, and one pumpkin produced 55 pumpkins in one plant.
It's amazing stuff, and I agree. It can be the combination of comfreys, sunchokes, monardas, any of the sunflowers. Cup plant is very allelopathic to things and will probably outcompete it. Those would be kind of my strategy. And I really appreciate you taking our abstract discussion of weeds and turning it into an opportunity to talk about a specific one. So that was great. But
what about goats? Bring in some goats every now and then.
No, we're just outside of downtown. We are not allowed to have goats.
No, that won't work. Okay.
Yeah, no, we would love to have goats. And we know a city council member. He actually rents a quarter of our land and grows market veggies on it. And so, yeah, I mean, we've been conspiring to change laws, but we're definitely not there yet.
Yeah. Well,
I would like to say in my defense, like, I accept all the other weeds. I'm more than happy to go out and harvest the hairy cat's ear and the dandelions. And, we've got lots of weeds that we live in harmony with. It's just the blackberry that is the bane of our existence.
I think that's fair. Like if you listen to my approach to gardening, some people I think are a little bit too maybe a little bit naive about weeds, in my opinion, because there's just good research that shows that certain weedy plants will reduce the yields of things. So if you're growing tomatoes and you have a bunch of things that are proven to reduce the yields of tomatoes, you have to make a decision about whether or not you want to tolerate that weed or have higher tomato yields. So we can make mindful decisions about them. And part of that decision is allowing things and figuring out which things to allow and where. And, you know, I actually kind of do like Himalayan blackberries. I think they're really tasty. And I think there are areas and spaces where they could be not a problem. But I would never plant them. And I would only tolerate them if I had like a mowing strip with like a grassy area that I was mowing that prevented that Himalayan blackberry from invading the rest of my garden. And I would work to push it back to a point to where I would want to tolerate it. Because if it's just left in the rest of the garden, it's got that weird sprawling habit that it just makes the garden really difficult to deal with. So I agree with you. You don't have to apologize or speak in defense. I think you're being a smart gardener by being mindful of it.
Thanks.
Yep. Well, on that note, that's what I have for you. And I would invite you to think about other ways where this idea of finding higher leverage points could be transformative for your garden and your landscape, and perhaps for your other life goals too. The same sort of thinking could be great for like motivating kids to study better and things like that. They have a lot of applications in helping us change and recognize that we might be using brute force methods, and we want to look up to systems and deep change, things that will have higher leverage. All right. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. On Wednesday, we're going to be talking about permaculture's most powerful tools for transforming the landscape and meeting our needs. Any last thoughts, questions, comments? If you hang out for just a second, I'll go grab the link to the folder where the videos are at, okay? I'll be right back. And if you gotta go, bye. Okay, here it is. I want to show you where it's at. So I'm actually going to load it here and show you.
So is it going to go in the chat, or is it going to go? Is it possible to put it on a Facebook page? Because that's
No,
very easy for me to access.
Yeah,
Email.
it won't be possible for me to put it on a Facebook page because these are materials that I am.
Oh yeah. Okay. Okay.
Most of them. I'm trying to make as much. Bye, Zach. Thanks. I'm trying to make as much accessible as I can through people like Zach and in the Facebook group. But there are some things I would like to try to hold on.
Okay, just exiting the Zoom meeting there. So there you have it. Wow, what a fantastic class that was. I really enjoyed the way he put that all together. Patterns are one of my favorite parts of permaculture. It's always been one of my favorite parts of being in and interacting with nature too. It's just noticing all the little systems that interlock with one another and affect each other's way of life, really. So yeah, wow, what a fantastic class. And it's so great that I was fortunate enough to be able to stream that, because that usually is a private class that you got to pay the money for and whatnot. So yeah, Fibonacci, some cool stuff. Noticing those different patterns that run throughout the world. What's everyone thinking? How's everyone doing? And again, that's a lot to absorb. So if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed, don't worry. If you ever really tripped hard, you'd see it. I've never really tripped hard, so I guess I have yet to experience that sort of thing. But that sounds pretty cool. Glad you're still here, John. I hope you're taking things in well. yeah, any questions about any of that stuff? Like, you know, there's no question too simple. There's no dumb questions or anything like that. So don't worry about that. I'm always here to help people along their process wherever, whatever part of the path they're on. So yeah, don't worry about me being that puny question or anything like that. That's not my style at all. Um, Terracing, yeah. I mean, I guess there's only so much you can fit into a 3 hour class. We'll be doing this again Wednesday for his next class. I'm pretty sure he's gonna allow me in on that one as well. So I already forgot what he just said his next class is gonna be, but I'm sure it'll be fantastic and eye-opening as well. Yeah, check out that link to that permaculture book. I'll put that up once more. Permaculture Designer's Manual. And the thing about this one is you don't really have to feel bad about taking a free PDF of it. Let me just put it in 1 second. Because it's out of print. So the only way to get it is online. And I've seen copies run into the $200 and $300. So yeah, there's a free PDF. You don't have to worry about that sort of thing. But I think we're going to leave it there for tonight. Let's give you some time to go back and absorb everything. So for those of you joining me on Twitch, and especially to my new followers, thank you so much. Thank you very much, Timmers, for the generous subscription for the tier 1 there. Thank you so much. It's only been, I'd say, 2 or 3 months that I've made affiliate. So yeah, I'm always happy when I start getting those people excited enough to actually put some money towards it. That's really special and nice in terms of feedback for what I'm doing. So thank you. But anyway, for those of you on Twitch, if you have any suggestions of who you'd like me to raid into, that's what we'll be doing next. Let's see who's on right now. Left Flank Vets would be a good choice. Who else is on? You got any suggestions? Let me know. Indie News Network's pretty cool as well. Pretty new to them. Been a while since we rated Bread Crochets, so we might do him as well. But just let me know if you have any thoughts on that. Otherwise, I'll just pick somebody. Let's see. What is Left Flank Vets doing right now? Doing stuff on MLK Day, and Coulter breaks up with Trump. FBI post cringe. Dylan Burns. Is Dylan Burns on right now? I didn't notice him. I don't think I've ever raided into Dylan Burns. He is. He's got 623 people. I usually like to support a little bit smaller creators, mostly because, you know, I raid in with a handful of people. I don't even get noticed a lot of the time. So I think we'll do Left Flank Vets. So if you're seeing this from somewhere that's not Twitch, here's another cool leftist person to follow, or channel. It's multiple people. Left Flank Vets. As the name suggests, they are veterans of various branches of the armed forces. All of them leftist as well, not just liberal, but far left of that. So it's always a good time on their show. They cover a lot of really cool topics. Tonight they're doing stuff on MLK, maybe? I'm not sure exactly where they're at in their programming, but we'll start the raid in just a second here. Thank you all for joining. Thanks to everyone who raided in from Idan Simpson. One of my big inspirations for doing this was Idan Simpson. One of the first communities I really joined and was a part of was his. So yeah, cool. It's cool to get a raid. All right, starting the raid as soon as I can get it going here. Thanks, and hope to see y'all Wednesday.